The rain had stopped an hour before the ceremony, leaving the dirt road to the chapel slick and dark, and Eleanor Whitfield had taken this as a sign, though she could not have said of what. She stood now in the small bedroom at the back of the Carver ranch house, the one that had belonged to Thomas's mother before the fever took her, and watched her own hands shake as she unpinned her hair in the mirror. Down in the front room, the last of the wedding guests were finishing their cake and their whiskey, and she could hear her new husband's laughter carrying through the log walls, warm and easy, the laughter of a man who had gotten everything he wanted that day. She envied him that. She envied anyone who could feel a single, uncomplicated thing. Thomas Carver was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders from 10 years of ranch work, with a quiet gentleness that had surprised her from the first time they'd spoken at the Sunday social 8 months before. He was not a man given to demands or to temper, and in the weeks of their courtship, he had never once made her feel rushed, never once made her feel like a transaction to be settled. He had asked her to marry him on a hillside above the river, with the cottonwoods gone gold in the September light, and she had said yes before he'd even finished the question, because she had wanted, more than anything, to believe that a good and simple happiness was still possible for her. That belief was the one she was struggling to hold on to now, alone in this room, with her wedding dress still damp at the hem from the walk across the yard. She heard his boots on the porch steps a while later, and then the door, and then his voice, softer now, asking if he could come in. She said yes. He entered carrying 2 cups of cider, still smiling from whatever joke had followed him out of the front room, and when he saw her face in the lamplight his smile faltered and then dropped away entirely. She was already crying. She had been crying, quietly, for several minutes, and she had not managed to stop it before he came in, and now there was nothing to do but let him see. He set the cups down on the dresser without a word and crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair, the way a man kneels before something he is afraid of breaking. He did not touch her yet. He only looked at her, his brow drawn with a worry that had nothing performative in it, and he said her name once, quietly, as though testing whether she would answer to it still. She wanted to tell him it was nothing. She wanted to laugh it off the way brides in stories were supposed to laugh off their wedding night nerves, some blushing joke about foolishness, and let him gather her up and let the evening carry them both forward into whatever came next. But Thomas was not a man she wanted to lie to, not on this night of all nights, and so instead she reached for the small drawer of the nightstand, the one where she had hidden, 3 hours earlier, a letter that had arrived that very morning by the same rider who'd come out from town with the last of the wedding flowers. The letter was from a lawyer's office in St. Louis, and it concerned her brother Daniel. Eleanor had not spoken of Daniel to Thomas beyond the barest facts, the way a person mentions an old wound without describing the wound itself. Daniel was 3 years younger than her, and when their parents had died of the same winter fever within 4 days of each other, it had been Eleanor, 17 years old, who had raised him the rest of the way. In a 2-room house in Missouri with a garden she'd learned to tend from nothing, and a rifle she'd learned to fire because a woman alone with a boy needed to be able to protect what was hers. Daniel had grown up fierce and restless and endlessly grateful in the awkward, prideful way of boys who know they are owed a debt they can never repay, and when the war came for the second time in his life, not the one that had orphaned them, but the one that swallowed half the young men of their county, he had enlisted against her pleading, 17 himself by then, and marched away east with a rifle he barely knew how to clean. The telegram had come 11 months later. Missing, presumed dead, at a crossing whose name she had since made herself forget, because she could not bear to see it written anywhere, in any context, ever again. She had grieved him the way a person grieves a limb, not all at once, but every single day, in the reaching for something that was no longer there. She had told herself, eventually, that surviving him was its own kind of betrayal, and that the only way to make it bearable was to build something, someday, worth having survived for. Thomas, and this ranch, and this life in the wide grass country of Wyoming, 400 miles and 4 years from that Missouri house. This had been her answer to that grief. She had built a happiness on top of the grave she had never gotten to dig, and some nights she believed in it completely, and other nights she felt like a thief in her own life. The letter, she told Thomas now, her voice unsteady, her hands unsteady worse, was from a lawyer representing a man named Daniel Whitfield, who had been recovering for the better part of 4 years in a veterans hospital in Illinois under a name that was not his own, having lost, in the chaos of a field surgery after the crossing, not his life but a great portion of his memory of it, including, for a long while, his own name. He had regained it slowly. He had spent 2 years searching, through what few clues remained to him. For a sister he remembered only in fragments, a woman's hands braiding his hair before church, a rifle report in a cold garden, a voice singing something he could no longer name the tune of. A neighbor from their old Missouri township, tracked through a chain of correspondence Eleanor could hardly follow even now, had finally been the one to place him, to say yes, I know that woman, she went west, she married a rancher in the Wyoming territory, and here is where you might begin to look. The letter said he was alive. The letter said he was, as of 6 weeks ago, well enough to travel, and that he intended, God and railroads willing, to come find her before the year was out. She had read it standing in the kitchen at 9 o'clock that morning, in her wedding dress, 40 minutes before she was due to walk down the aisle of the little clapboard chapel on Thomas's arm, and she had folded it and put it in her bodice and gone and married the best man she had ever known with her whole heart cracked open like a peach, joy and grief pouring out of the same wound at once, because she could not tell, in that moment, and could not tell now, which one was the larger feeling. She had thought of Daniel through her entire wedding. She had thought of him during the vows, during the ring, during the first dance in the yard under lanterns strung between the fence posts. She had smiled and laughed and meant every bit of both while carrying, underneath it all, for years of a grief she had never gotten to finish, now overturned entirely, replaced by something almost more frightening than the grief itself, hope. That was why she was crying. Not from fear of him, not from any dread of the night ahead or the marriage beginning, but from the impossible, unbearable fullness of learning, on the one day she had built her whole heart around a new beginning, that an old ending she had spent 4 years learning to live inside had never actually happened at all. Thomas did not say anything for a long moment after she finished. He took the letter from her hands, careful as a man handling something sacred, and read it twice by the lamp, his jaw working the way it did when he was holding something back, and when he looked up at her his own eyes were wet, which she had not expected and which undid her more than anything else could have. He told her, then, in the plain unhurried way he told her most things, that he was not going to pretend to understand the size of what she was carrying, because he had never lost a brother and could not know it from the inside. But he told her that he understood this much, that she had spent their entire courtship, and very likely their entire wedding day, holding a grief so large she had learned to build a life around its shape without ever once complaining of the weight, and that a woman capable of that kind of quiet endurance was exactly the woman he had wanted to marry, though he had not known, until this hour, the full measure of what her endurance had cost her. He told her that he did not need this night to be anything in particular. He did not need her laughter or her ease or her attention, not tonight. What he wanted, he said, taking her hands in both of his, was simply to sit with her, for as long as she needed, and to hear about her brother. Not the missing boy, not the grief, but the real one, the one who used to exist before the war took even the memory of him away from her for 4 years. He wanted to know what Daniel's laugh sounded like. He wanted to know if he'd been a good shot, and whether he'd hated his chores, and what he used to call her when he was small enough to still need her for everything. And so that was how they spent their wedding night. Not in the way the guests downstairs, still finishing their whiskey and their cake, might have imagined, and not in the way Eleanor herself, dressing that morning, might once have pictured either. They sat together on the edge of the bed with the lamp burning low, and Eleanor talked, haltingly at first and then in a flood she could not stop, about a boy who used to hide her chores behind the woodpile so she'd have to hunt for them laughing, about the terrible tin whistle he'd played every evening one whole summer until she'd nearly lost her mind, about the last morning she'd seen him, 17 and trying so hard to look like a man in a uniform 2 sizes too large, promising her he'd be home by harvest. She talked until the lamp burned low and the cabin outside had gone quiet. The last of the guests finally departed into the dark, and Thomas listened to every word of it without once looking like he wished she would stop, without once making her feel that her grief was an intrusion on what the night was supposed to be. Somewhere past midnight, when she had finally cried herself empty and lay against his shoulder with the letter still open on the quilt between them, she found herself laughing, A small, surprised, exhausted laugh, the first real one of the whole long day, at the strange shape her life had taken. She had walked into this room that evening bracing herself for one kind of reckoning and had instead been given another, gentler than she could have designed for herself. She told Thomas that she had been so afraid, these last months, that loving him meant she was finally, fully letting Daniel go, closing some door she owed it to her brother to keep open. Now she understood that she had never needed to choose. The door had never closed. It had simply been waiting, unbeknownst to her, for both of them to walk back through it together. Her brother returning from a war that had never quite finished taking him, and her own heart, wide enough after all, to hold a marriage and a resurrection in the very same night. Daniel arrived at the ranch 11 weeks later, on a gray afternoon in early winter, thinner than she remembered and carrying a scar along his hairline he would not fully explain for another year, but alive, entirely and miraculously alive. And when Eleanor saw him step down from the wagon at the end of the lane, she was running before she knew her feet had decided to move. And Thomas stood back on the porch and let her have that first long minute entirely to herself, watching his wife fold her lost brother into her arms in the cold ranch yard, both of them crying the way people cry when grief finally gets to become something else. That night, the three of them sat late at the kitchen table by lamplight, Daniel eating like a man who had forgotten what a proper supper tasted like, telling stories in a voice roughened by things he would take years to speak of fully, and Eleanor found herself thinking, watching her husband refill her brother's coffee without being asked, that the tears she had shed on her wedding night had not been an omen after all, or if they had been one, it was not the kind she had feared. They had been the first tears of a grief finally, fully allowed to finish itself, so that something new, something whole, something she had never quite dared hope for, could finally begin.